Isolation is a season that every great man or woman must face at some point in life. It is not a place of abandonment, but of divine alignment. When God isolates you, it's not to break you, but to build you. It's in the quiet, lonely spaces that he does his greatest work. Think of Moses in the wilderness, Joseph in the prison, or David in the caves. Each was isolated before they were elevated. Isolation is not the end, it is preparation for what's ahead. During these times, God removes distractions, reveals himself, and refines you into the person he's called you to be. The discomfort of isolation is a sign that you are being transformed. You are being shaped for a purpose greater than you can imagine. This message is about understanding the why behind the season of isolation and embracing it with faith and purpose. If you feel alone, cut off, or like your world has been turned upside down, you are not forgotten. You are being prepared. When God isolates you, one of the primary reasons is to refocus your attention on him. Life is filled with distractions, relationships, work ambitions, and even good things like ministry and service can divert our attention from the one who created us. In the midst of the noise, it can become difficult to hear his voice clearly. That is why God, in his wisdom, sometimes pulls us away from the crowd and places us in solitude. Isolation is not about punishment, it is about realignment. Consider this: when you are in a crowd, it is almost impossible to have a meaningful conversation with someone. The noise and commotion around you drown out the sound of their voice, and your attention is divided. The same principle applies spiritually. When our lives are cluttered with noise, both external and internal, it becomes challenging to discern God's direction for our lives. Isolation creates an environment where all distractions are stripped away, leaving you with no one and nothing to depend on but God. In these quiet moments, God reminds us of who he is and who we are in him. He becomes the focus, not our achievements, relationships, or ambitions. We begin to realize that our true identity is not found in what we do or what others say about us, but in our relationship with him. Isolation is a season where God recalibrates our hearts to align with his purpose, teaching us to trust him above all else. This process often feels uncomfortable. We are social beings by nature, and the removal of people or activities we are accustomed to can feel like loss. But in reality, it is gain. God is creating space for deeper intimacy with him. In isolation, the distractions fade away and we can hear his whisper. His voice becomes clearer, his word becomes alive, and his presence becomes tangible. It is in these moments that he deposits revelations that can only be received in stillness. When Elijah fled into the wilderness, he experienced this kind of divine refocusing. After facing opposition and feeling overwhelmed, Elijah found himself alone, sitting under a broom tree and praying for death. Yet, in that moment of despair, God met him in a still small voice, not in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but in the silence. This encounter changed Elijah's perspective and reminded him of God's sovereignty. Similarly, God uses isolation in our lives to reveal himself in ways we would never experience in the noise of daily life. In the season of isolation, we are also reminded of our dependence on God. When everything we've leaned on is removed, we come to the realization that he is our source. This is not just a theological truth. It becomes a lived experience. We learn to rely on his provision, his wisdom, and his timing. Like the Israelites in the wilderness who depended on manna daily, isolation teaches us to trust God one step at a time. He becomes our sustainer, and we come to understand that he is enough. Isolation also exposes the idols in our lives. These idols are not always physical objects, but can be anything we prioritize above God. It might be a career, a relationship, or even our own dreams and ambitions. When we are isolated, these things are stripped away, and we are confronted with the question, is God truly first in our lives? This stripping process can feel painful, but it is necessary for spiritual growth. God is a jealous God, and he desires our undivided devotion. In isolation, he purifies our hearts and redirects our worship to him alone. Furthermore, isolation creates room for God to birth new vision within us. When we are caught up in the busyness of life, it is easy to become short-sighted, focusing only on immediate needs and goals. But in solitude, God lifts our perspective. He begins to reveal his plans and purposes for our lives, plans that are often much greater than we could have imagined. This is why so many biblical leaders received their calling or vision during a time of isolation. Moses encountered God at the burning bush while tending sheep in the wilderness. Paul spent years in Arabia after his dramatic conversion, being taught by the Spirit. Even Jesus withdrew to solitary places to commune with the Father and receive clarity for his mission. Isolation is a breeding ground for divine revelation. It is important to recognize that this process of refocusing is not always instant. It requires patience and a willingness to surrender. Often, our first reaction to isolation is resistance. We want to fill the void with distractions or rush through the season to return to normalcy. But rushing only prolongs the process. God's work in isolation is intentional, and we must allow Him to complete it. This means embracing the stillness even when it feels uncomfortable and trusting that He is doing a good work in us. One of the most beautiful aspects of isolation is that it prepares us for a deeper relationship with God. In the absence of external distractions, we learn to commune with Him in a more intimate way. Our prayer life deepens, our understanding of His Word grows, and our worship becomes more genuine. We come to know Him not just as a distant creator, but as a close personal friend. This intimacy with God becomes the foundation for everything else in our lives. As we are refocused in isolation, we also gain clarity about our priorities. The things that once seemed important may no longer hold the same weight. Our values shift as we align our hearts with God's will. We begin to see our lives through His eyes, recognizing what truly matters. This clarity not only impacts our relationship with God, but also transforms how we relate to others and approach our purpose. Ultimately, the season of isolation is a gift. It is a time of pruning, refining, and realignment. While it may feel uncomfortable, it is a sign that God is working in us and preparing us for what lies ahead. When we emerge from isolation, we do so with a renewed focus, a deeper faith, and a stronger sense of purpose. So if you find yourself in a season of solitude, do not despair. Embrace it as an opportunity to draw closer to God and allow Him to refocus your life for His glory. Isolation also serves as a tool for building character. In the silence and solitude of this season, God is not only removing distractions, but also refining our inner nature. This is a critical stage in the development of a person's faith and character. It is in isolation that the flaws and weaknesses of our character are exposed, and God begins the process of transformation that prepares us for greater responsibilities and assignments in His kingdom. Without the noise of the world, we are forced to confront ourselves. We can no longer hide behind our busyness or rely on external factors to shape our identity. It is in isolation that God allows the depths of our hearts to be revealed, and this exposure can be both challenging and liberating. Sometimes when we find ourselves alone, we are forced to confront fears, insecurities, and unresolved issues that we have been able to avoid in the past. This process can feel uncomfortable because it requires us to face the truth about ourselves, both our strengths and weaknesses. However, it is in this moment of confrontation that God begins the work of sanctification. He uses the stillness of isolation to mold our hearts and refine our character. The qualities that we may have neglected in the past, like patience, humility, and self-control, are nurtured in this period. Like a goldsmith who places raw gold in a furnace to remove impurities, God uses the heat of isolation to purify our hearts and remove things only reflecting His image. The discomfort we experience is the result of God's loving hand shaping us into the vessels He has called us to be. God's refining process often involves testing our character. During isolation, we may face moments of doubt and temptation that challenge our faith and integrity. These tests are not meant to break us, but to build resilience. They are designed to stretch our faith, deepen our trust in God, and strengthen our spiritual muscles. Just as athletes train in solitude, pushing their bodies beyond limits to grow stronger, we are similarly stretched in isolation to grow stronger spiritually. These tests teach us how to rely on God, not on our own strength or understanding. They teach us how to endure hardship with grace and to trust in God's timing, even when the situation seems bleak. One of the most crucial aspects of character building in isolation is learning how to wait on God. Our culture prizes speed and immediate results, but God often works in seasons, and His timing is not always aligned with our desires. Waiting in isolation teaches us the value of patience and the importance of trusting God's perfect timing. We may not always understand why we are in a particular season or why things aren't moving as quickly as we'd like, but it is in waiting that we learn to trust God's process. The longer we wait on Him, the more we learn to depend on His wisdom rather than our own. In isolation, we also learn the value of humility. When we are isolated, we are removed from the approval of others. There are no accolades, no applause, no one to praise us for our achievements. This stripping away of external validation can be humbling. But it is in this humility that God can build in us the character necessary for leadership. Humility teaches us to rely on God's strength, not our own, and to recognize that everything we have is a gift from Him. It helps us to stay grounded and focused on serving others rather than seeking personal gain or recognition. Additionally, God uses isolation to teach us self-discipline. In the absence of distractions, we are forced to take responsibility for our actions, thoughts, and decisions. God's refining process in isolation helps us cultivate spiritual disciplines such as prayer, fasting, worship, and study of the Word. These practices form the foundation of a strong, resilient faith that can withstand trials. Just as a tree grows stronger when its roots are deepened in the soil, our faith grows deeper as we root ourselves in God's Word and presence during times of isolation. One of the most significant aspects of isolation before elevation is the development of a servant's heart. When God isolates us, He often removes the spotlight from our lives. We are not receiving accolades or recognition, and we may feel like our efforts are going unnoticed. However, this period of invisibility is important because it teaches us to serve without expecting anything in return. We learn to be faithful in the small, unseen moments, knowing that God sees everything we do. When we are promoted, it is not about our own glory, but about serving others and fulfilling God's purpose for our lives. Elevation without a servant's heart leads to pride and self-centeredness. But when we serve with humility and isolation, we are prepared to serve others in greater ways when we are elevated. Elevation also brings spiritual opposition, and isolation strengthens us to face these challenges. When God isolates us, He equips us with the strength and wisdom needed to withstand the opposition that will come with elevation. Just as Jesus withdrew to the wilderness to prepare for His ministry, we too must go through periods of solitude to prepare for the spiritual battles ahead. The greater the calling, the greater the opposition. Isolation prepares us spiritually to withstand these battles and to stand firm in our faith, no matter the challenges we face. It is important to understand that God's elevation process is not always linear. There may be times when we feel like we are taking 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. But during these times of apparent stagnation, God is still at work preparing us for the next level. Just because we are isolated does not mean we are stagnant. God is doing a deep work in us, preparing us for greater things. In the waiting, He is refining us, building our character, and equipping us with the wisdom and strength we need to step into our purpose. In conclusion, isolation is not a punishment, it is preparation. It is a necessary part of the journey to elevation. God uses isolation to refine our character, deepen our relationship with Him, and equip us for the responsibilities that come with promotion. Just as an athlete trains in solitude for a championship, we too are being prepared in isolation for the greater purpose God has for our lives. The greater the calling, the greater the preparation, and isolation is an essential part of that process. When we embrace isolation, we are embracing God's plan for our elevation. Let us trust Him during these times of solitude, knowing that He is preparing us for something greater. Isolation is a time of divine preparation for the destiny God has for you. It is not a time of abandonment or being forgotten, but a purposeful season where God is molding and shaping you for the next chapter in your life. One of the most profound ways God uses isolation is to build your dependence on Him. In a world that often encourages self-sufficiency and independence, isolation teaches us that we cannot accomplish our purpose alone. It strips away the illusions of self-reliance and brings us to a place of complete dependence on God, where He becomes our source for everything, our strength, wisdom, provision, and guidance. During isolation, God strips us of the crutches we lean on, whether that's relationships, career, or our own talents and abilities. All these things are good in their place, but they can never replace our need for God. In isolation, He shows us that everything we need for life and godliness comes from Him. Just as a tree cannot thrive without its roots deeply embedded in the soil, we cannot fulfill our purpose unless we are grounded in God. When we are isolated, we realize that we cannot manufacture the power to move forward on our own. We must lean on His strength, wisdom, and provision, and this is where true spiritual growth takes place. The Bible gives us numerous examples of individuals who were isolated by God and learned to depend fully on Him. Take the story of David, for example. Before he became king, David spent many years in the wilderness, fleeing from Saul and living in solitude. During this time, he learned to rely on God's protection and provision. He wrote many of the Psalms during this period of isolation, songs that expressed his dependence on God in times of trouble. It was in the wilderness that David was transformed from a shepherd boy into a king. Had he not gone through this period of isolation, he would not have learned to trust God in the way he did, nor would he have been prepared to lead Israel. Similarly, when the Apostle Paul had his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, he spent 3 years in Arabia before beginning his ministry. During this time, God was refining him, teaching him, and preparing him for the work ahead. It was in isolation that Paul gained the deep spiritual insights that shaped his letters and teachings, which continue to impact the church today. God used Paul's isolation to develop him into the apostle who would bring the message of the gospel to the Gentiles. If Paul had not been isolated, he may have rushed into ministry without the spiritual depth and understanding that came from his time alone with God. When God isolates you, he is doing a deep, transformative work within you. You may feel that your progress is slow, but in reality, God is aligning your character with your calling. The isolation is a period of pruning. God is cutting away the parts of you that are unfruitful and not aligned with his purpose. Just as a gardener prunes a tree to ensure it bears more fruit, God is removing the things in your life that would prevent you from bearing the kind of fruit he desires. This pruning process can feel uncomfortable because it involves loss, but the loss is not in vain. Every area that is cut away in isolation is an area that would have hindered your progress in fulfilling your purpose. The more God refines you in isolation, the more he is preparing you to bear lasting fruit. Furthermore, isolation is a time of inner healing. It allows God to heal wounds and hurts that we may have ignored or buried while we were busy living our lives. It is often in solitude that God reveals areas of brokenness that need his healing touch. These wounds may be from past relationships, disappointments, or personal failures. In isolation, God gently brings these issues to the surface so that he can heal them and restore us to wholeness. This healing process is crucial because God cannot use a broken vessel to carry his purpose unless it is first healed. Isolation provides the space for God to do the deep inner work that makes us whole and fit for his service. Healing in isolation also allows us to process our emotions in a way that we might not have been able to when we were surrounded by the distractions of daily life. In solitude, we can confront our anger, grief, sadness, and fears, allowing God to bring peace to our hearts. This emotional healing is necessary for us to move forward in life with a clear mind and a calm heart. Without it, we may carry unnecessary baggage that could hinder us from fulfilling God's purpose for our lives. In addition, isolation is a time when God reveals deeper dimensions of his nature. When we are alone with him, we have the opportunity to experience his presence in ways that we may never have known in the hustle and bustle of life. It is during these quiet moments that we discover the depths of his love, faithfulness, and grace. We learn to hear his voice more clearly and understand his will more intimately. God reveals himself to those who are willing to sit quietly in his presence and allow him to speak. He teaches us who he is and reminds us of who we are in him. The deeper our relationship with God grows during times of isolation, the more we are equipped to carry out the assignment he has placed on our lives. Just as a soldier must go through training to prepare for battle, we must go through periods of isolation to prepare for the spiritual battles ahead. God uses these seasons to strengthen our faith, build our character, and refine our spiritual understanding. When we emerge from isolation, we do so with a deeper relationship with God and a clearer understanding of his plan for our lives. We are ready to step into the next season of our destiny, knowing that God has been faithful to prepare us. Finally, isolation reveals the purpose for which God has created us. It is in these quiet moments that we begin to understand the unique calling and destiny that God has placed on our lives. In the solitude, he speaks to our hearts and reveals the specific purpose he has for us. We begin to see the bigger picture of our lives and understand how the trials and challenges we have faced have been part of God's plan to prepare us for that purpose. Isolation helps us rediscover our passions and gifts, and it provides clarity about the direction we should take. When we are in the world's noise, it is easy to become distracted by the opinions of others and lose sight of the purpose God has for us. But when God isolates us, he pulls us away from all of that so we can hear his voice clearly. In isolation, he unveils the specific calling he has placed on our lives, and we are able to move forward with confidence, knowing that we are walking in alignment with his purpose. In conclusion, isolation is a time of divine preparation. It is a season where God refines our character, heals our wounds, strengthens our faith, and equips us for the purpose he has for our lives. While isolation may feel like a lonely or discouraging time, it is actually a time of great opportunity. It is in isolation that God does his most profound work, preparing us for the next level of our destiny. So instead of resisting the season of isolation, embrace it. Allow God to work in you and through you, knowing that he is preparing you for something greater. Isolation is not the end. It is the beginning of a new chapter in your journey toward fulfillment and purpose. Isolation is a season that every great man or woman must face at some point in life. It is not a place of abandonment, but of divine alignment. When God isolates you, it's not to break you, but to build you. It's in the quiet, lonely spaces that he does his greatest work. Think of Moses in the wilderness, Joseph in the prison, or David in the caves. Each was isolated before they were elevated. Isolation is not the end, it is preparation for what's ahead. During these times, God removes distractions, reveals himself, and refines you into the person he's called you to be. The discomfort of isolation is a sign that you are being transformed. You are being shaped for a purpose greater than you can imagine. This message is about understanding the why behind the season of isolation and embracing it with faith and purpose. If you feel alone, cut off, or like your world has been turned upside down, you are not forgotten. You are being prepared.